You're listening to The Greater Loop, a podcast from the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. In each episode, we bring to you leaders who connect Houston to the world, from business to diplomacy, innovation to impact. This is where global conversation begins. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to The Greater Loop, a podcast of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. My name is Marianne Maldonado, and today we are exploring a fascinating chapter of American history that still resonates today: the Red Scare, McCarthyism, and the impact of Blacklists on culture, politics, and society. Joining us is Clay Risen, a journalist and author of Red Scare, Blacklists, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America. Clay has written extensively about 20th century American history, politics, and civil liberties, shedding light on the forces that shaped modern America. Clay, thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Well, we're excited to have you here in Houston, but let's talk a little bit about what your book is about. And for listeners who may not be as familiar, how would you summarize the Red Scare and the McCarthy era, and what made it transformative in our history?
So, put briefly, the Red Scare was a period, really the first decade after the end of World War II, where great concerns about communist infiltration, about the Communist Party of the United States, about espionage, sort of shaped domestic politics. This was the first decade of the Cold War, the first decade of the nuclear era. People were incredibly afraid of where things were going, whether the country was on solid footing in its new face-off with the Soviet Union, and those fears were manipulated, taken advantage of by a variety of political actors, cultural actors. What was at the heart a concern about national security became just a series of witch hunts that did great damage to American civil liberties, and I would say did a lot to shape American culture and politics for decades to follow.
So what inspired you to write Red Scare, and maybe what new perspectives or findings did the book bring out in what we know is maybe well-known history?
Yeah, so I started working on the book a while ago. It was about 2017. I had written several books at that point, mostly dealing with post-war American history. One of the things when I was thinking about what book to pursue or topic, it struck me that a lot of what I had worked on was shaped by the Red Scare in terms of civil rights politics, policymaking, foreign policy. Even when people didn't say Red Scare or anti-communism, the fears of that era, the kind of leftover, the residue of that era, put limits on what people were willing to do. It shaped choices that were made. Lyndon Johnson famously, was afraid to end the Vietnam War early on because he didn't want to be labeled as soft on communist. You can go down the list. And so I sort of came to the realization that the Red Scare or this kind of fear of communism and being labeled a communist was this sort of dark matter, or dark energy in American politics that wasn't really observable, but it was there, and it filled in all these spaces and helped explain a lot of what came afterward. And so I really wanted to go back to that era to look at the Red Scare in those terms. I mean, yes, of course, it was a great violation of civil liberties, and I think that that's really the heart of it. But I also wanted to examine it through the lens, not so much of today, but certainly of how did this echo on through after the Red Scare was over? A lot of my history, a lot of what I work on is I'm very interested in these sort of traces and ways that historical eras continue to resonate in the culture even after we say they're over. And that's one of the things I think, aside from individual stories, material facts that I uncover in the book and talk about for the first time, really the perspective I think is for me the most important thing is this, the way that the Red Scare continued to shape American life and politics long after McCarthy was gone.
In our society now, we're inundated with all things social media, all things AI. the blacklist concept really has transformed, but maybe you could tell us about the affected writers and authors and actors that it impacted in so many ways. How were they blacklisted in that time in history?
Yeah, so it happened in different ways. It sort of depended on where you were. So in Hollywood, the blacklist was largely enforced by the studios, who said, if you are on a list that we ourselves generate, where we think that you are someone with a suspicious background, maybe you joined the wrong group, maybe you signed the wrong petition, we're the origins of the list was not always really well understood. But if you were on that list, then you were not allowed to work in Hollywood. Now, you were not allowed to work for one of the studios. I mean, in theory, you could find something else, but essentially you were kicked out of Hollywood. And this was especially bad for actors who couldn't hide. You know what the actor looks like. For writers, it was still pretty hard, but they could work under a pseudonym. They could go maybe find work somewhere else. But it was pretty effective in clearing out progressive thought from Hollywood. Similar things happened in other areas. Publishing, for example, publishing houses were under a lot of pressure not to work with certain writers. And the pressure came from both the government and the fear that congressional committees or the Department of Justice or the FBI would start to put real pressure on, say, a publishing house or a studio, but also from the grassroots. There was a lot of activism around groups like the American Legion, traditional groups, establishment groups, but also these sort of pop-up groups that defined themselves as anti-communist activists. In fact, in Houston, there was one group or a chapter of a group called the Minute Women. The Minute Women actually were a national group. They were all over the place, but the Houston chapter was especially powerful. An analog today would be Moms for Liberty. These were people who kind of took it on themselves to be guardians, particularly of schools. So you'd get Minute Women who would show up to school board meetings and say, well, we can't have this book on the reading list because the author is this person. And you saw versions of that happen throughout society, and whether it was libraries or schools or State Department libraries overseas, writers in particular came under a lot of pressure.
I know that this had huge impacts on the political and social climate. Are there patterns we should recognize in today's society that could be very similar and to take us to that type of thinking?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I came away from in my work on the book, and I think is sort of a lesson that applies certainly at various times in American history, is that it's often the case that it's these moments like the Red Scare, what we might call a witch hunt, sometimes has a kernel of truth to it. And during the Red Scare, there was a real reason to be worried about Soviet espionage, to question the American Communist Party and its loyalty to the United States and to maybe keep them under a microscope. That's all perfectly legitimate and I think justified. What happened was that those specific concerns became blown out of proportion very quickly and became, I'd say sort of metastasized into this hysteria that was not just about law enforcement or counterintelligence. It was about freedom of speech, freedom of association out in society. It was not just about the government. It was about, as I said, grassroots groups, about sort of para-government organizations. And so, so I guess my point is that we should always be very worried about this, right? So yes, we should always be on the alert when, particularly in times of foreign policy crisis, we should be on alert for, efforts to undermine American society, espionage, legitimate things. But we also have to be incredibly vigilant about not letting those concerns spill over into a free-for-all where people maybe they're zealots, maybe they've got personal interest, there's sort of opportunists who are looking to boost their own credibility. These people very quickly can take over, and a general feeling of fear, a sentiment of fear, can do a lot to really undermine the things that we are trying to defend as a country.
You mentioned fear. How did the ordinary American respond to this fear and suspicion and all the scrutiny that was going on, though it didn't apply directly to them, but it peripherally did?
Yeah, it's funny. You can look across the period of the Red Scare, roughly from 1946 to, the mid 50s, and find moments where people aren't paying that much attention, other moments where people are paying a lot of attention. You can find areas where the Red Scare didn't really have much of an impact, and other areas where it had immense impact. And a lot of it was driven by moments, right? So when the Korean War began, people really freaked out and started paying a lot of attention to the idea that the enemy was also within. They were very open to these. And that's not coincidentally right when McCarthy took off, when the Soviet Union developed the atomic bomb much earlier than we expected. That was a time of really close, people were following the news and they were very afraid and they were very open to demonization. But, there were other times when that concern slacked off and it was left to kind of the fear mongers to kind of keep things going. So it's it would be hard to chart, and it would certainly be hard to say this was always the way things were everywhere. It's more interesting to look at where and why did the Red Scare really manifest in certain places? Why was it always such a big deal in Hollywood? Why was it not a big deal in the theater world in New York? I mean, I get into all these and I talk about the reasons in the book, but it's interesting. I think it's really important to understand a lot of this has to do with power. A lot of it has to do with influence and what avenues people are paying attention to. Hollywood is obviously always going to be an attractive target, and not coincidentally, that it often was.
I'm sure you have followed some of the stories post these blacklist characters or individuals. Are there stories of resilience that have resonated and maybe you could also speak to how it phased out?
Yeah, so there were a lot of people whose lives were destroyed by the Red Scare, who long after they were exonerated or paid their price, were hounded by the FBI, were kept out of work. There's a woman whose story sort of fills the prologue and epilogue of the book. And her name was Helen Bryan. She was a progressive activist, worked for a refugee group, and she was the first person found in contempt of Congress by the House Un-American Activities Committee, and ended up going to jail for refusing to go along with the committee. And when she got out of jail, she couldn't find a job. She was continuously hounded till eventually she went into retirement. And I won't give away the end of the book, but she does, I think for me, represent both sides. She's someone who was resilient and refused to the end to play along. And yet she was also greatly harmed by it. There are people who did bounce back. Dalton Trumbo was maybe the most famous screenwriter in America. He was one of the original Hollywood 10 who was blacklisted. He ended up helping to bring the blacklist to an end in the late 50s in Hollywood, and ended up, I wouldn't say completely resuscitating his career, but he did fine for himself. And so there are these different versions out there. But, unfortunately, there are a lot of people who, gave up to just depression and despair because of this, and so there's a long trail of tragedies. But as far as why it ended, part of it was like a forest fire. Eventually it runs out of fuel, and the world changed. Stalin died. The Korean War ended. The sort of politics and geopolitics settled down during the Cold War. But I'd also say that there were enough people who really stood up, and whether it was people like Edward R. Murrow, who was a journalist at CBS and he was a TV journalist and ran a very insightful, really, really ripping expose about McCarthy in 1954 that helped take down Senator Joseph McCarthy in the Senate. There were people writers who kept standing up and attacking the Red Scare. I think a lot of it also played out in the courts. In my book, in the book, Earl Warren, who was governor of California, not someone you would ever think would be a civil liberties icon, when he took over, when he became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, became exactly that. And we know him for his work on Brown versus Board of Education and on civil liberties in the 1960s, but he also played a very important role in tearing down the architecture of the Red Scare. A lot of the legal mechanisms, a lot of the law enforcement techniques that were used to prosecute the Red Scare, Earl Warren led the court in pulling those back. And I think that did a lot to help make sure that even as the steam came out of the Red Scare, the engine and the mechanisms by which it operated could no longer be used. And I think that's one of the lessons of the Red Scare is that, it's both the energy and the legal framework and the architecture that are necessary to make it happen. And so anyone worried about these sorts of things recurring need to focus on both of those sides.
And related to that, Clay, in your view, how can history like this help guide us in protecting some of the civil liberties that we have while addressing national security concerns?
Yeah, I think it's always going to be a balance. And it's always going to be something that some people focus on. You'd like to think that everyone should keep both of those things in mind. But of course, there are people who focus on civil liberties and there are people who focus on national security. And that's a good thing. We should have specialization out there, but also everyone on both sides needs to keep those things in mind. And I know that today, hopefully, a lot of people in the national security world and in the civil liberties world recognize that there is a need to balance these two things. But I think the thing that history teaches us is that the threats come along unexpectedly and very quickly, and in ways that both resemble the past, but also take novel new directions. I would actually point to the period after 9/11 as one where it could have been a lot worse. And of course, we know about a long list of civil liberties violations after 9/11, but there are also a lot of instances where civil liberties groups, elements of the government pushed back against what could have been, I'd say, a much more vicious and deleterious attack on the civil liberties, particularly of Muslim Americans and of dissenters. This was not as bad as it could have been. And I think that a lot of people, when they were engaging with these questions of how do we balance civil liberties and national security post 9/11, had in mind the lessons of the 20th century and the Red Scare and understood that civil liberties had to be a check on the protection of national security, and national security needed to be a reason to consider how we shape civil liberties. And so I just hope that as we go forward, we can keep all of these lessons in mind.
Absolutely. Clay, thank you for joining us, kind of explaining a little bit of a historical perspective, a global affairs perspective, and also a civic engagement perspective. We look forward to hosting you at the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. And thank you all for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.